Well, I just asked us to jump on and just have a quick chat about Thistledown, because when we were first talking about getting the Old Wine Conference going, I contacted Giles and we had a chat. Because I knew that you'd been working with growers of old vine fruit in Australia, and what you told me about the impact that your project had been able to make on the kind of sense of pride and also the economic return that those growers were able to achieve, I thought really striking. So yeah, would you just like to tell us a bit about Thistledown and the old vines that you're working with as part of that project?
Yeah, absolutely. So Thistledown's relatively young. Our first vintage was 2011, a notoriously wet vintage, which everybody tried to forget about pretty much as soon as they'd made. But we started at a time when I guess it was very lucky that Grenache in particular was still in the doldrums in Australia. Fergal, Tynan, the other MW involved in Thistledown, and I originally set up Thistledown because we were slightly frustrated with the sort of the stereotypical international perception of Australian wine as having to be massively extracted, oaky, fruit sweet. And we knew from extensive travels over a long period of time that didn't have to be the way. So we were looking for a way of kind of representing Australia in a more balanced, more textural, more kind of aromatic style. And as we were doing a lot of research for Thistledown, we kept coming across these incredible old vineyards that people would allow us to buy fruit from. And as outsiders to either the Barossa or McLaren Vale, we found this pretty bizarre that we could just walk into these incredible old historic vineyards. But a lot of the time they were literally begging us to take the fruit, and they weren't asking an awful lot of money for it either. And it just so happened that it was in the real sort of, it was at the bottom of the market. Grenache had been, as I'm sure most of you know, had been one of the most planted varieties in the whole of Australia, but had gradually gone through 30 or 40 years of decline due to the weakening of the fortified market and the vine pool scheme in the 1980s, which really targeted a lot of old vine material in McLaren Vale and Barossa. So we were able to walk in, and we were doing people a favour to actually buy old vine Grenache, which now seems utterly ridiculous because there's queues down the road for people wanting to try and get their hands on this. But we realised pretty soon that there was a kind of a twofold problem. One, there was a lack of awareness of quite how good a lot of this fruit could be, but also a winemaking problem as well, in that I think a lot of, because Grenache had been a low priority for a lot of these winemakers, and that it has this perception of being a late harvested variety that will hang on, because it was low priority. They did literally let it hang on. And so a lot of the wines that were being made from virtually kind of dried, concentrated fruit. And the wines just weren't very nice. And so it created this kind of vicious cycle of, there wasn't much demand for it, so it was low priority. Then the wines made were poor, and so there was no demand for it. So we realized that we had to, along with a few other wineries, change the style of wines that was made, so that people actually wanted to drink it. And if people wanted to drink it, we'd be able to charge a little bit more for it. We'd therefore be able to pay people a little bit more money for the fruit. And then they would have an incentive to keep those vines in the ground. And that was the premise that we started out with, that we had to try and put a foundation under the value of this fruit, so that the growers had a reason to actually carry on. And I guess the proof of the virtue of that plan was that last year, 2021, McLaren Vale Grenache was the most valuable variety in the region, having overtaken Cabernet and Shiraz. So it's a complete turnaround. And I guess we've made a bit of a rod for our own backs these days, because we are still buying from growers who are now able to charge us 3 times what they were back in 2011.
You're able to sell the wines, aren't you? The wines are very successful. The Thistledown range you sell.
Yeah, we're lucky enough. I mean, Australia's got a few problems at the moment, but it's a kind of a 2-speed wine economy in Australia. At the lower end of the market, there are a lot of problems. But Thistledown is generally about premium small batch wines. And yeah, we're pretty lucky at the moment that we're waiting on 22 wines to be bottled, because most of our single vineyard stuff sold out. But I mean, when we're talking about the actual availability of old vines, I don't think people realize quite how finite a resource they are, particularly in McLaren Vale, which is where most of our Grenache comes from. There's 70 hectares of true old vine material in McLaren Vale, which is nothing. You go to Spain and there's hectares of old vine Garnacha as far as the eye can see, but it is a very, very finite resource that we're dealing with. And fortunately, I think we've reached the lowest point of when vines were still being pulled out and people are beginning to plant again now. But of course, that brings with it risks as well. But yes, we're lucky that we, along with a small band of other kind of old vine Grenache specialists, seem to be riding a little bit of a wave at the moment in terms of interest in the variety and in the value of old vines as well.
And do you think that Grenache is a variety that really requires age to show its greatness in vines, I mean?
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, I love old vines. I love the restriction on yield that they naturally put in, the wisdom that almost comes with old vines and their ability to, I think, push flavor above sugar, which is really, really important for us. I mean, we're kind of the absolute opposite of the old stereotype of old vine means higher concentration and more power. For us, working predominantly with old vines gives us the ability to actually pick a little bit earlier, which helps us make wines that are more of the style that we wanted to make. And my own kind of theory on that subject is that older vines, because they're more adapted to their environment than younger vines are, they are able to work with any sort of signs of oncoming stress, either climactic stress or disease stress or anything like that, and prioritize their ability to reproduce over a younger vine. And the way they obviously do that is by producing fruit, but also by producing fruit that birds want to eat or other animals want to eat. And the way that they can do that is to make the fruit as attractive as possible, as early as possible, if they know that the vine is going to come under stress. So for us, it's about getting that flavor through earlier, so that we're not having to pick up really, really high potential alcohols, which when you do that, you've obviously got problems with lower acid, lower pH, higher pH, and you have to do more in the winery to make those wines actually fit for purpose. That said, we are working with 1 or 2 younger vine vineyards. We've got one vineyard that we work with very high up in the Eden Valley. It's about 650 meters up. That's only about 10 years old. But because the soils and the environment are so poor, the restriction on yield that is created means that you do get that concentration that otherwise you wouldn't get if it was a young vine. So yes, we much prefer working with old vines, and I think Grenache in its youth is extremely vigorous and pushes sugar way above flavour. And that's just not the style of wines that we want to be making. Both Thistledown and the movement to make contemporary Australian Grenache is much more about kind of aromatics and texture and layers of flavour than it is about that old kind of stereotypical Australian fruit sweetness. So what we're trying to do is work to restrain a lot of that exuberant fruit. And it's much easier to do that with an older vine than it is with a young vine that's pushing sugar over and above flavour.
Thank you. And I'd just like to say we do have some of the wines available to taste, and they are like crackling energy, racy, you know, spine-tingling Grenache, and I think they're great examples. And I know that you know, yeah, like you say, you've kind of been a victim of your own success, but that's great.
It is, but I think the nice thing is that in the period of time that we've been making these wines, we've actually been able to see that the growers are beginning to flourish again. And well, one of the wines that we make, this charming man, is made from Bernard Smart's vineyard. He's 90, still driving a tractor in the vineyard, but he went the best part of 40 years without being able to sell his fruit commercially. And he used to get families, Greek and Italian families coming from Sydney and Melbourne to buy his fruit, either to sell as just grapes in the market or to make wine at home. And he carried on tending that vineyard, knowing that there wasn't a commercial crop coming from it. And now he's got a queue of people down the road wanting to buy his fruit. So I mean, it's incredibly reassuring that us and others have been able to help to completely turn around that situation for them and reward them in their own lifetimes. Quite often people don't see the rewards of all of their labor in their lifetime, and they've been able to do it. So I think from an old vine, but also as kind of a sustainable and a commercial sustainability viewpoint, it's been an incredibly sort of successful movement.
Fantastic. I don't think I can say anything that's better than what you just said. So I'm just going to say thank you. Look forward to getting to more of the wines, and thank you.
Not at all, pleasure. Thanks very much for inviting me on.